At my sister's wedding, she mocked me in her speech. My sister is a single mother, unwanted by anyone. Does anyone want to pick her up? My mother laughed. She's a used product, but still functional. She even comes with a defective son. Ha ha. The room filled with laughter. That moment, the groom slowly stood up. As he began to speak into the mic, the entire room froze. Morgan Taylor tapped the calculator keys in her cramped home office while reviewing a client's financial statements. The flickering light of late afternoon reminded her she had just 30 minutes before she needed to pick up her son Logan from school. She glanced at her watch as she finalized a year-end report. Her 10-year-old son poked his head around the door, his sandy brown hair flopping over inquisitive blue eyes. "Mom, are you almost finished?" he asked. "I've got a question about my history homework." Morgan lifted her coffee mug with a smile. "Give me 10 more minutes and I'll be with you," she said. "Did you do all your math problems?" Logan held up a sheet of paper. "I did, but I got stuck reading about ancient civilizations. I don't get why they built things so differently back then." Morgan felt pride well up inside her. She had raised her son by herself since he was a baby, juggling work at a small local accounting firm ever since her father died of a heart attack 5 years earlier. She never once let her responsibilities weigh her down in front of Logan. "We'll figure it out," she promised. "Just let me finish up here." Right then, her phone rang. Seeing the name Charlotte on the screen, Morgan released a slow breath. Her mother's calls never seemed to bode well. "Hello?" Morgan said, pressing the phone to her ear. "Morgan, about tomorrow's dinner," Charlotte began in her usual crisp tone. "Your sister's bringing her fiancé. You'll be there, won't you?" Morgan's sister Harper had always been the family favorite. She was an extroverted beauty as opposed to Morgan, who was deemed too serious. "I'll be there, Mom," Morgan answered. "I'll bring Logan, if that's okay." Charlotte's sigh crackled across the line. "Fine. Just make sure he behaves. This is Harper's big moment, and it's a high-class gathering." Morgan bit her tongue. Her son was always well-mannered. The real problems usually came from her mother and sister. "Sure," she said, ignoring the subtle dig. "What does Harper's fiancé do again?" "He's an investment banker," Charlotte replied, her voice suddenly thick with pride. "Ethan Grant from a prominent family. Very cultured. Graduated from Harvard." Morgan nodded stiffly, grateful her mother couldn't see her rolling her eyes. Charlotte's priorities had always revolved around social standing and appearance, two things Morgan had never cared to chase. When she hung up, she saw Logan standing in the doorway, his expression understanding. "Is Grandma mad about something?" he asked. "She's just excited about your aunt's wedding," Morgan answered, choosing her words carefully. "It's easier if we don't get in her way." The next evening, Morgan and Logan arrived at Charlotte's spacious suburban home. Morgan paused at the front step, taking a steadying breath before resting a reassuring hand on her son's shoulder. Logan lifted his gaze to hers. "It's okay, Mom. I know Grandma and Aunt Harper aren't really fans of us." Morgan's throat tightened at his honesty. Children were far more perceptive than adults realized. Still, she mustered a smile and rang the doorbell. As soon as they stepped inside, boisterous laughter spilled from the living room. Harper appeared, wearing a showy cocktail dress that displayed her perfect figure. She was holding a glass of wine, laughing at something the tall, dark-haired man beside her had said. Charlotte waved them in with a stiff smile. "Morgan, Logan, you finally made it." Harper turned, glass in hand, and offered Morgan a quick, hollow greeting. "Oh, there you are. Come meet Ethan Grant." The man Harper introduced as Ethan stepped toward Morgan. He looked to be in his early 30s, with warm brown eyes and an expression that was calm, almost gentle. Morgan felt a ping of recognition, as though she'd glimpsed his face somewhere long ago. "Nice to meet you, Morgan," he said quietly. "Harper's told me a bit about you." He held out his hand, and Morgan shook it, struck by the warmth of his palm. "This must be Logan?" Ethan added, turning to the boy. Logan nodded, a little shy. "I'm in 5th grade, he announced, as if that was his most important attribute. Ethan knelt slightly to Logan's level. "That's a good age. When I was in 5th grade, I made a huge model of the solar system. You into science?" "Science is cool," Logan said, brightening. "We're learning about planets next month." Harper cleared her throat. "Ethan, could you get me another glass of wine?" He straightened at once, politely excusing himself. Morgan watched him go, a bit surprised that such a mild-mannered guy could be Harper's choice. During dinner, Charlotte and Harper talked endlessly about the upcoming wedding. The lavish gown, the venue, the expensive caterers. Morgan's opinions were neither requested nor welcomed. Halfway through the meal, Harper angled a patronizing glance her way. "You won't need to worry about a bridesmaid dress," Harper announced with a tone that could only be described as saccharine. "We're keeping it small, so it's just my closest girlfriends." Morgan's stomach clenched. "Oh," she said softly, trying to mask the sting. "I see. Yes, it's better this way," Charlotte chimed in. "We know how busy you are with your job and raising Logan." Logan shifted uncomfortably, his hand drifting under the table to squeeze Morgan's. Across from them, Ethan cleared his throat. But wouldn't family be part of the wedding party? He asked. It's a special day for everyone, right? Of course it's special, Harper said with a tight smile. But the slots are already taken. Besides, my sister and I aren't super close. Morgan noted that Ethan looked troubled by Harper's attitude. She managed a grateful smile in his direction. At least someone at the table seemed concerned about kindness. After dinner, while collecting dishes, Morgan found Ethan beside her in the kitchen. Let me help, he offered. It's all right, Morgan replied, rinsing a plate. I'm used to it. Mom and Harper let me handle the practical stuff. Ethan studied her thoughtfully. You're not at all like Harper described, he said quietly. Morgan turned off the tap. And how did she describe me? He hesitated. She said you were dull and resentful, he admitted, looking apologetic. But clearly you're not. A half laugh escaped Morgan. Guess she thinks someone who is an accountant must be boring. Ethan gave a small shrug, as though at a loss. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk more about it, he said. You and Logan. I'd like to spend time with both of you. He slipped out of the kitchen before Morgan could reply, leaving her with a surge of confused warmth. She quickly finished up, then ushered Logan to the car. He frowned as they settled into their seats. Ethan was nice, Logan said, thoughtfully tapping his sneaker against the floor mat. He paid attention to me, Mom. Why's he marrying Aunt Harper? Morgan's laugh came out a bit strangled. Logan, you can't just say that, she told him gently, even though she was wondering the same thing. Ethan seemed so different from Harper, almost her polar opposite. As the wedding grew closer, Morgan felt more like a bystander than family. Harper and Charlotte didn't invite her to taste test cakes or visit venues. Instead, Morgan's involvement was strictly behind the scenes, handling some minor billing tasks, emailing the catering company, anything that required an eye for detail. She didn't mind the tasks themselves, but it hurt to be kept at arm's length. One afternoon, while Morgan was reviewing a contract at Charlotte's request, Ethan showed up unexpectedly. He found her in the living room sorting through the wedding planner's chaotic notes. You're helping them again? He said, and she caught that faint hint of disapproval in his voice. Don't they have a wedding planner? Harper's busy, Morgan replied, not looking up. And Mom's only interested in the big, flashy decisions. He watched her work for a moment, then cleared his throat. Do you ever get the feeling we've met before? Morgan blinked at him. It's funny you ask, she said. There's something about you that's familiar. Whatever they might have figured out next was cut off by Logan rushing in. The boy flashed a triumphant grin. I finished my research project on ancient Rome, he announced. The Roman roads are pretty impressive. Ethan's expression softened at once. I remember studying that stuff, he said, chatting easily with Logan about old civilizations. Morgan felt a swell of gratitude. Most men from Harper's social circle had never shown more than a passing interest in her son. A week before the wedding, Ethan called Morgan unexpectedly. I want to talk to you about something, he said. His voice was low, almost urgent. I want you to be the maid of honor. Morgan nearly dropped her phone in shock. Harper's not even letting me be a bridesmaid. I spoke with her, Ethan replied. She agreed, reluctantly. But I think it's important that you stand up for her as her sister. Family events should include everyone. Morgan felt relief and nervousness swirl within her. I'm sure Harper hates this, she murmured. But thank you. Just as she expected, her mother called the next day, livid. Harper's crying, Charlotte hissed. She says you must have put Ethan up to this. I didn't do anything, Morgan said calmly. Ethan insisted. Charlotte made a scoffing noise. You always manage to look like some victim stirring up trouble for Harper. It's her big day. Morgan inhaled slowly, reminding herself to stay level. If Harper truly doesn't want me as maid of honor, I'll step down, she said. You can't, Charlotte snapped. Ethan insisted. Just don't show off, and don't ruin it for Harper. Morgan sighed as she hung up. The next few days were a blur of final tasks, and at no point did Harper speak kindly to her. She just tolerated Morgan's presence at dress fittings and on calls with caterers. Yet Ethan occasionally found small moments to talk or help with the details. Finally, the day of the wedding arrived. Morgan wore a demure sky blue dress, the simplest thing she could find for the role of maid of honor, hoping it wouldn't upset Harper. Her mother eyed it with distaste the moment they saw each other in the church's foyer. Well, Charlotte said, pursing her lips. That's plain, just like you, I suppose. Morgan swallowed back a retort. She could feel Logan's hand gripping hers. Mom, you look great, he whispered. She forced a smile and squeezed his hand back. In the bride's preparation room, Harper was surrounded by her bridesmaids, looking every inch the glowing bride in her ornate gown. When Morgan stepped inside, Harper merely nodded and turned away, too busy with her final touches to say anything. Morgan forced herself to stand quietly against the wall, ignoring the tension in the room. The ceremony went smoothly enough. Morgan maintained her best smile as she walked behind Harper, holding the train of the gown, while guests admired the bride's entrance. She saw Ethan's gentle expression at the altar, his gaze flicking her way with what looked like reassurance. That look helped ease some of her anxiety, though Charlotte and Harper's dismissive attitudes still weighed on her heart. Once the formalities concluded, everyone moved to the reception hall. The newlyweds entered to cheering, and the festivities began. Toasts, dancing, scattered laughter. Morgan tried to keep to herself with Logan, quietly sipping punch, but soon the microphone was passed to Harper. She stood in front of everyone, white gown shimmering under the lights. "I want to thank everyone for being here on the happiest day of my life," Harper began sweetly. She gushed about how love had changed her world, how wonderful it was to be part of an extraordinary family. Then she turned toward Morgan with a sudden slyness in her eyes. "This is my sister, Morgan. Some of you may not know her very well, but she's a single mom who, well, never got around to finding the right man." A few laughs spread uncomfortably among the guests. Morgan felt her stomach lurch. She tightened her hold on Logan's small hand. Harper let out a contrived laugh. "I'm just joking, of course," she trilled. "I'm glad she's here. Maybe someone in the crowd wants to adopt her." Another wave of awkward chuckles rippled across the tables. Morgan's face burned, but she forced herself not to react. Charlotte then reached for the microphone. Morgan's always been the dull one," she said with a forced lightness. "And, well, used goods." She paused for effect, but I suppose someone might still be interested. "She comes complete with a built-in child." This time, the laughter grew louder. Morgan stood in a paralysis of shame, tears burning at the back of her eyes. She glanced at Logan, who was biting his lip, trying not to cry. She felt her heart shatter into pieces. Over the microphone, she heard Harper squeal with more mock laughter. Morgan rose from her chair, intending to guide Logan outside. She had no desire to keep enduring this humiliation. She couldn't believe her mother and sister would publicly ridicule her like this, especially at an event filled with so many onlookers. Before she could make a move, Ethan stood up. The entire hall went silent. From the corner of her eye, Morgan noticed how tense he looked, his shoulders stiff, his face flushed with suppressed anger. The clinking of silverware and idle chatter stopped abruptly as people realized the groom was about to speak. Ethan stepped away from Harper, moving into the center of the room with slow deliberation. His face reflected a level of anger and determination none of the guests had seen from him before. An uneasy hush spread over the tables as people realized something major was about to happen. He looked from Harper to Charlotte, then over to Morgan and Logan. "Before we continue this reception," he said evenly, "I'd like to address the speeches we just heard. Those words weren't just in poor taste, they were cruel. And I can't stand by and pretend I accept them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Harper's cheeks had turned blotchy, and Charlotte looked momentarily stunned. Morgan was frozen, one hand wrapped around Logan's, unsure what Ethan was about to say. She had only just stood to leave, but now found herself rooted to the spot. Ethan took a breath. "I was raised to believe that families should lift each other up, not tear each other down. What happened here tonight was the exact opposite." He glanced at Logan, who was watching with wide, confused eyes. "I can't participate in humiliating a boy I admire or a woman I respect." Harper tried to laugh it off, though her tone was shaky. "Ethan, darling, come on. You know how Morgan can be—" "Stop," Ethan interrupted. The force of that single word made Harper's face go taut. The entire hall fell silent once more. "This isn't just about some offhand jokes," he said. "It's about the way you and your mother have treated Morgan and Logan all along. You talk about them as if they're less than, and I can't condone that." Charlotte stood up, looking outraged. "Ethan, what do you think you're doing? These are private family matters. If you have an issue, we'll settle it quietly." Ethan's expression hardened. "You made it public the moment you decided to insult Morgan in front of everyone. Now everyone here deserves to know the truth." Morgan watched as he drew in another steadying breath, as though he was building up the courage to share something deeply personal. "I have a confession. Morgan and I haven't just met recently. Our paths crossed 10 years ago." He paused, searching the crowd's faces. "The reason I remember it so vividly is because my sister Abigail was battling leukemia. She spent her final months in a hospital not too far from here." A whisper of recognition lit in Morgan's eyes. She had volunteered at that hospital a decade ago, helping patients and families navigate paperwork, offering moral support. She recalled a young man who had hovered in the background, distraught over his sister's condition. Could that have been Ethan? He pressed on. "I was in my early 20s, grappling with grief and fear. Abigail was older than me by 2 years, and losing her felt like my entire world was collapsing. My parents were consumed by their own sorrow, so I often found myself alone, until I met a volunteer who offered kindness and strength when I needed it most. Her name was Morgan. A sharp intake of breath escaped Morgan's lips. The memory flared like a bright light. The young woman she was back then, determined to help patients after surviving her own serious illness in her teen years, offering empathy and a listening ear whenever someone looked lost or overwhelmed. Harper gawked at Ethan. "You never told me any of this," she said, as though betrayed by his omission. Ethan continued, ignoring her. "Morgan used to bring her little boy, too. Logan would sometimes hold up crayon drawings to cheer up the patients." He turned toward Logan, his voice warmer. "You probably don't remember, but your art gave Abigail hope in her darkest days. She talked about your drawings all the time." Logan looked up at his mom, wide-eyed. Morgan's heart pounded at the realization that Ethan was the same man who had once quietly thanked her in a hospital corridor, whose tears she'd witnessed when he thought no one was looking. Ethan took a moment to compose himself. "I never forgot that kindness. When Abigail died, Morgan tried to comfort me, then she vanished from my life. I didn't know her full name or how to get in touch. For years I wondered what became of that volunteer who'd shown so much compassion." Morgan's eyes brimmed with tears at the mention of Ethan's sister. She remembered that kind but devastated young man, yet his features back then had been blurred by sorrow. Now, seeing him under the bright lights of a wedding hall, it all clicked into place. Ethan turned to Harper, voice resonating across the room. "When I first met you, I had no idea you were Morgan's sister. It wasn't until we got serious that I realized the connection. I was thrilled by the chance to reconnect with someone who'd meant so much to me and my family. But whenever I asked about Morgan, your words painted her as some miserable person who barely functioned as an accountant, single mom, whatever insulting label you chose that day. I couldn't reconcile it with the memory I had." Morgan felt Logan tug at her sleeve. She leaned down so he could whisper, "Is he talking about me, Mom? I drew pictures in that hospital for someone?" She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You did, sweetheart. You were 5 years old." Harper's face was twisted with anger and fear. She could see the wedding was collapsing around her. "This is absurd," she snapped. "You're making it sound like we're monsters. Mom was joking around, that's all." Ethan shook his head. "Cruelty isn't a joke, and the more I saw how you and your mother treated Morgan, the more my doubts grew. I hoped you might change, but tonight shows me that was wishful thinking." Harper threw her bouquet to the floor, frustration boiling over. "You're humiliating me in front of everyone. You can't do this." Ethan lifted the microphone to his lips, glancing at the guests before leveling his gaze at Harper. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I can't marry someone who shows no respect for her own sister and nephew. Consider this wedding canceled." A collective gasp rose throughout the hall. Dozens of phones were out, capturing every word or streaming it live. Ethan slipped the wedding band off his finger and placed it on a nearby table. Charlotte made a strangled sound, but he didn't glance her way. Instead, he walked over to Morgan and Logan, who stood in stunned silence. He extended his hand. "Come with me," he said gently. Morgan stared at him, chest heaving with conflicting emotions. Relief, gratitude, confusion, disbelief. Slowly, she slid her hand into his. Logan followed suit, holding Ethan's other hand. Around them, the room erupted into chaos. Harper screaming at Ethan's retreating back, Charlotte rushing forward to demand an explanation, guests whispering in shock. Ethan bowed slightly to the officiant. "I apologize for the disturbance," he said, stepping aside so Morgan and Logan could walk with him toward the exit. "I'll settle the bills," he added, tossing the words over his shoulder. "Send any invoices my way." He led Morgan and Logan out into the warm afternoon air. The sun was bright, as though the world beyond the church still believed a joyful wedding was taking place. The abrupt silence outside made Morgan realize how loud it had been inside. "Are you sure?" Morgan asked, voice trembling. "This will bring you so much trouble," Ethan nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything. I'm doing what I should have done the moment I realized how Harper and your mother behave." He opened the passenger door of a sleek car, and Logan climbed into the back seat. Morgan hesitated for just a second, then followed. As Ethan closed the door, they saw Harper rush out of the church, her wedding gown trailing across the pavement. She shouted after them, but her voice was muffled by the closed windows. Ethan sighed heavily as he turned the key in the ignition. "Let's get out of here." Morgan caught a glimpse of Harper in the side mirror, tears streaking her makeup, her carefully styled hair coming undone. Charlotte was a few steps behind, breathless and fuming. Several gawkers milled around, phones in hand, capturing the meltdown. Logan spoke softly. "Where are we going?" Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror at the boy. "I don't know, but somewhere quiet to breathe." He put the car in gear, and they eased away from the church and the chaos left behind. They ended up driving to a small bistro by the coast, a place with simple wooden tables overlooking the water. Once they were seated on the terrace, the three spent long minutes simply gazing out at the gentle waves. The tension and adrenaline of the wedding fiasco still buzzed through Morgan's nerves. "I'm sorry," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. "I never wanted it to go down like that, but I couldn't keep silent anymore." Morgan shook her head. "Don't be. Honestly, I'd been planning to leave with Logan the moment they started humiliating us, but I never expected you to speak up the way you did." Ethan covered her hand with his. "They crossed a line, and I should have confronted it sooner." Logan was picking at a napkin, trying to process everything. "So, your sister had leukemia and my mom helped her?" "I didn't know that." Morgan explained gently. "You were only 5, Logan. I sometimes took you with me to volunteer at the hospital. You'd color pictures and give them to patients. Apparently Ethan's sister was one of them." Ethan nodded, eyes filled with gratitude. "Abigail was 24 at the time, just 2 years older than me. She saw a lot of kids in the cancer ward, but she used to say how your visits, Logan, were a reminder that even a hospital could be a place of hope." Logan's cheeks turned a little pink. "I wish I remembered that better." Ethan reached over to ruffle the boy's hair. "Your drawings are actually part of why I was able to cope after she passed. You and your mom gave me a sense that there was still kindness in the world." They paused as a waiter approached, dropping off glasses of water and menus. No one spoke until the server left, and even then, they all struggled to find the right words. Eventually, Morgan took a breath. "I saw how devastated you were back then, but I never knew how to reach out after. I wasn't in a position to track anyone down, and I didn't know your name." Ethan nodded. "Life carried us in different directions." He gave Morgan a faint, sheepish smile. "And then I met Harper at a corporate event. She was so outgoing. I was drawn to her energy in a dark time of my life, but I started seeing glimpses of her real attitude. She talked about her family, always praising your mother, always putting you down." Morgan shrugged. "I've grown accustomed to being the family punching bag. You shouldn't have to be." Ethan set his menu aside. "No one deserves that. Now, I know I've caused a scene, but I needed to. It was the only way to make sure no one could twist the story later. And," he hesitated, "I realize the person I truly admire here is you, Morgan." Her breath caught, and she glanced at Logan, who was listening with bright, curious eyes. She'd sheltered him for so long, doing her best to shield him from the barbs of her mother and sister. And now here was Ethan, all but declaring that he valued them both far more than a flashy wedding or public image. Logan cleared his throat in a way that suggested he was trying to be brave. "Mom, we can't go back there, can we?" Morgan shook her head gently. "Not tonight, at least. I'm not sure how Grandma and your aunt are going to react, but we both know it won't be pleasant." Ethan's phone started buzzing, the screen lighting up with Harper's name. He sighed and let it go to voicemail. "Whatever it is, she can relay it through lawyers if she wants. I doubt she's interested in an amicable chat." Morgan exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "I'm sorry you're going through this because of us." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "No, don't apologize. You're not the cause. You're the reason I realized how toxic everything was. I've been half asleep for months, pushing aside my doubts." Logan studied the older man with an air of openness. "So, you're not going to marry Aunt Harper anymore?" Ethan shook his head. "No, buddy, I'm not." Then he offered a wry smile. "Might sound dramatic, but I've never felt more free." They spent the next hour sipping cold drinks and picking at appetizers, talking about everything except the wedding. It was Logan who asked about Ethan's job in finance, brightening considerably when Ethan described how numbers and strategies could shape people's lives for the better. Morgan, an accountant, found herself intrigued by his stories of investments and philanthropic ventures. They clicked in ways she couldn't have imagined: lighthearted banter, shared jokes, a natural flow of conversation. Eventually, the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the ocean a dark, shimmering blue. They reluctantly stood from the table, Ethan insisting on covering the bill. Then he drove Morgan and Logan back to their apartment building. As he walked them to the door, Morgan felt an odd pang of disappointment at the thought of him leaving. "Thank you," she said quietly, searching his eyes in the soft glow of the porch light. "For everything. Speaking up for us. Explaining who you are. I don't know how to process it all yet, but I'm grateful. I'll never regret doing it," he said. Then he smiled down at Logan. "I'd like to see you two again tomorrow if that's okay. Maybe we can figure out what comes next. Together." Logan looked up at his mom hopefully. Morgan felt her heart lighten. "We'd like that," she murmured. After they said goodnight, Morgan watched from her window as Ethan's car pulled away. A single lamp illuminated the small living room, casting warm light on the boxes of wedding materials Charlotte and Harper had thrust into her care. She realized she had no reason to keep them. One by one, she gathered them up and set them aside. She found a new voicemail from Charlotte, as expected. The words were angry and accusatory, claiming Morgan had manipulated Ethan into calling off the wedding. Morgan deleted the message without hesitation. For once, she felt no guilt. Logan wandered into the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, are you sad?" She leaned down, kissed his forehead, and led him to his room. "No, sweetheart. I'm relieved, and maybe a little hopeful." He crawled into bed, hugging his pillow. "I liked how Ethan stood up for us," he mumbled, drifting off. Morgan stood there for a moment, heart full. Then she turned out the lights and went to her own room, checking her phone one last time. A text had just arrived from Ethan. "I hope you both got home safe. Let's meet in the morning, if you can. And don't worry about anything Mom or Harper says. They can't touch the way I feel right now." Morgan smiled and typed back, "We're home safe. Talk tomorrow. Good night." She placed her phone aside, crawling into bed. Although the day had begun with dread, it was ending with a sense of promise. She closed her eyes and let that warm feeling carry her towards sleep, unaware of how drastically her life had shifted and how much happiness might be on the horizon. Early the next morning, she woke to birds chirping outside her window. She made breakfast, coaxed Logan to get ready for school, and halfway through buttering toast, realized with a rush of amazement that she felt no trace of tension, no impending confrontation with her mother, no forced wedding errands, just a day stretched out in front of her, waiting to be filled. Logan noticed her mood. "You look really happy, Mom," he said, reaching for a slice of toast. "I'm glad." Morgan ruffled his hair. "I am happy," she said, surprised at the truth of it. "Come on, let's go. I don't want you late." For class, they stepped outside into the mild morning air. As they walked down the steps, Morgan spotted Ethan's car pulling up to the curb. He got out, offering a gentle wave. Logan grinned, clearly excited to see him again, and Morgan felt her cheeks warm. Ethan walked over, hands tucked casually in his pockets, that soft smile on his face. "Hey," he said. "Thought I'd catch you both before your day started. I can drop Logan at school if you want." Logan practically beamed at the offer. Morgan, her heart fluttering, nodded. "That would be nice. I'll have a bit more time to get to work." Ethan opened the passenger door for Logan, then paused to face Morgan. "After I take him, maybe we could grab coffee. We can talk about all of this." Morgan exhaled. "Yes, I'd like that." He smiled, looking as though a new path had opened right in front of them, and in that quiet moment, neither needed to say more. They both understood this was the start of something far more meaningful than a wedding in a fancy hall, something built on respect, gratitude, and genuine care for each other. And as Morgan slid into the seat beside him, she realized she was finally leaving behind the old patterns of ridicule and hurt, stepping into a future that felt bright with possibility.